Thank you for coming out on this gray Wednesday. My name is Troy Sherman. I'm the founder and managing editor of Politicus, a new undergraduate research journal on political and international affairs. This is our final public lecture of the school year, titled The Great Debate. Be it resolved that the doctrine of responsibility to protect the abandoned. And we have two sides that will be debating tonight. We have pro with Professor NOSSAL and Julia Kirby, and then we have the con with Professor Charles Pentland and IRFAN TAHIRI. So I'd just like to take this time to thank the Queen's Debating Union, who's helped us out with this event and provided our moderator for this evening. I'd also like to thank the Queen's International Affairs Association. Those two have been fantastic partners throughout this process, and we hope to continue working with them in the years ahead. I'd also like to thank the Arts and Science Undergraduate Society for their funding and support, as well as the Office of the Vice Principal of Research, without which we could not operate as a journal. So I will start off by giving brief introductions for our panelists tonight, and then I'll leave it off to the moderator who will explain the process of how everything will operate this evening. So I'll start with the students. Julia Kirby is a third-year economics student focusing on development economics. She currently holds the position of Secretary of the 170th Session of the Queen's Debating Union and is a member of their competitive debate team nationally and internationally. She has been involved in AMS committees including Students Against Poverty and the Education on Queer Issues Project, also known as EQUIP, as well as being a first-year intern for the AMS Social Issues Commissioner. She hopes to go to law school and is interested in international and human rights law. Our second student is IRFAN TAHIRI. He is a fourth-year political studies major and history minor. He has been an active member of the Queen's community, where he has spent a lot of his time assisting the Queen's University Muslim Student Association and the Global Initiatives Project. He is currently the Vice President of the Arts and Science Undergraduate Society. His primary academic interests lie in foreign policy making, international relations theory, global terrorism, and its alleged connection with religion. For our professors this evening, I'll begin with Professor Kim NOSSAL. Professor Kim NOSSAL went to school in Melbourne, Beijing, Toronto, and Hong Kong, and attended the University of Toronto, receiving his PhD in 1977. In 1976, he joined the Department of Political Science at McMaster University in Hamilton, where he taught international relations and Canadian foreign policy, and served as chair of the department in 1989 to 1990 and 1992 to 1996. In 2001, he came to Queen's University heading the Department of Political Studies until 2009. He has served as editor of International Journal, the quarterly journal of the Canadian International Council, Canada's Institute of International Affairs, president of the Australian and New Zealand Studies Association of North America, president of the Canadian Political Science Association from 2005 to 2006. He has served as chair of the Academic Selection Committee of the Security and Defense Forum of the Department of National Defense from 2006 to 2012. He is currently the director of the School of Policy Studies and is a valuable member of the Politicus panel of referees. And our last professor for this evening is Professor Charles Pentland, who was born in Montreal and graduated with a BA double honors in political science and international studies at UBC, received his MA in political science from UBC, and his PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He joined the Department of Political Studies at Queen's in 1969 and became a full professor in 1982. He was head of the department from 1987 to 1992 and has held visiting positions at l'Institut d'études européennes, Université de Bruxelles, the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton, the Centre d'études et recherche internationale et communautaire, the University of Manitoba, and the University of Cambridge. He was co-editor of the Journal of European Integration from 1977 to 1984, co-editor of the International Journal from 1984 to 1992, and director of the Queen's Center for International Relations from 2002 to 2010. Professor Pentland is also a valuable member of the Politicus panel of referees. So let's give them all a round of applause for coming out. Our moderator for this evening, like I said previously, is provided by the Queen's Debating Union. Renata is in her final year of undergraduate studies in political studies with a minor in health studies. She's been an active part of the Queen's Debating Union and the Canadian debating circuit more broadly for the last 4 years. Currently, she is the National Ombudsperson for the Canadian Society of Intercollegiate Debate, and she has traveled to places as far off as Manila and Chennai to represent Queen's and the world's university debating championships, where she was honored to chair panel discussions. Next year, she'll be attending the Norman Patterson School for Public and International Affairs to specialize in international institutions and global public policy. Let's give her a round of applause. We will also be filming tonight's event, courtesy of QTV. So if you have any issues with being recorded, please let myself know, or Woody, who is our Workshops on Lectures coordinator. We'll try to find arrangements for you. After it is complete and filmed, you'll be able to find it online at politicusjournal.com. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it off to Renata to run tonight's event.
So thank you so much, Troy, and for everyone for being here today. So as he said, I'm the moderator for tonight's debate. So just to give you a little bit of a preamble, so born out of the international community's failure to respond to horrific humanitarian tragedies, including the Rwandan genocide of 1994 and the massacre in Srebrenica in 1995, the doctrine of responsibility to protect, commonly referred to as R2P, represents an emerging norm within international politics, formally acknowledged by the United Nations in 2005. So the concept of humanitarian intervention has been a justification of the use of force against sovereign states. R2P bestows a duty upon the sovereign state to ensure the safety and protection of its people and seeks to prevent mass atrocities. If a state fails in this regard or willingly violates the responsibility of the international community, it has other states have the responsibility to intervene using coercive measures on behalf of the international community and these citizens. In many ways, R2P has been commended for taking into consideration humanitarian concerns and human security, while still respecting state sovereignty as much as possible. At the same time, R2P has been highly criticized for its moral underpinnings, which may mask ulterior motives and strategic intent. Recent events, in particular, for example, the Russian annexation of Crimea, discrepancies regarding the lack of intervention in Syria and Russia, and criticism regarding the intervention in Libya, have challenged the continued silence of R2P within the international community. Tonight, this topic will be debated in an attempt to shed more light on the future of R2P. So tonight I ask the question, be it resolved that the doctrine of R2P be abolished. So arguing in the affirmative is Professor NOSSAL and Julia Kirby, and on the opposition side is Professor Pentland and IRFAN TAHIRI. So therefore arguing against the abolishment of R2P. So the basic format of the debate tonight is Australian Asian style with a Canadian monk style twist, as we'll be using audience opinion to determine which side of the debate wins. I will ask you which side will win before the debate starts, and I will ask you which side, after each of the speakers has spoken, has won the debate at the end. So the debate will begin with the affirmative side speaking first. So the professor on the affirmative will speak for 7 minutes, followed by the professor on the opposition side, also speaking for 7 minutes, followed by the next student speaking for 7 minutes, and then the opposition student speaking for 7 minutes. And then at the end of the debate, the opposition professor will come back to give his closing remarks that will last for 3 minutes. And then the proposition professor, so Professor NOSSAL, will give the closing remarks for proposition side that will also last 3 minutes. So throughout the debate, just so everyone knows, the non-speaking side, so the side who's speaking opposition, has the ability to indicate the desire to interject or challenge the speaker as they're speaking. This is called a point of information. And the point of information is at the discretion of the individual who's speaking at the time. They can either wave it down or they can take it. So as moderator, I will be ensuring that, that no one speaks out of line and that also timing is being respected. So after the first minute of the speaker's time during the 7-minute speeches has elapsed, you will hear this, which means that the first minute has elapsed. For the next 5 minutes, the speaker has the ability to speak with their opposition potentially interjecting. At 6 minutes, you will hear this, which means that 6 minutes has elapsed and protected time once again starts, which means that no one can offer any points of information during that time. At 6 minutes and 30 seconds, I will raise my hand as such, indicating that the speaker has 30 seconds left of their speech to continue. At the end of 7 minutes, you'll hear a double bang, I guess. And then there's a 15-second grace period, by which time at the end of 7 minutes and 15 seconds, I will gently tap my hand, just letting the speaker know that their time is officially done. I will also ask the audience members to keep their questions until the end. Once the debate is over, I will lead the audience into a question period that will last for 15 minutes. So you can direct your questions to either side and to any of the debaters. Use this as an opportunity to ask questions and clarify any points that were made during the debate in order to assist you in making your decision. After this, I will ask the audience which side they support, at which point in time you basically decide who has won the debate. So the side with the most support obviously wins. Okay. And I guess without any further ado, I will sit down and welcome the Prime Minister of the debate to the floor to commence the motion that stands before the House. This House would abolish the doctrine of R2P. Hear, hear.
Just before we start, are we taking an initial opinion poll so we find out? Like,
oh, right. So I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I do have to take an initial opinion poll. So if everyone can, I guess, who feels that proposition, so should R2P be abolished, who is in favor of the motion?
Can we abstain on this motion?
You may abstain. You're not coerced into voting. So who is in favor of proposition side? Please raise your hands. So it does seem like a minority unless many people are abstaining. So please drop your hands. So who is in favor of the opposition side that R2P should remain in practice and in international law? So it does seem that the majority is in favor of opposition, which I will officially write on the board. Unfortunately, I have not recorded the number, but I think there's enough witnesses to tell me that it was indeed in favor of opposition, at which time the same number of witnesses will tell me who wins the debate at the end. So in any case, I let the debate proceed.
Madam Speaker, let me begin. I'm going to use this. Let me begin so that I can shout down my opposition after the protected time starts. Let me begin by thanking the Politicus, thanking the Queen's Debating Union, and KIAA for organizing the debate tonight. Madam Speaker, the results of the initial vote indicate quite nicely the degree to which people have bought into the idea of the responsibility to protect. But I want to suggest to you that people can easily support this when it simply comes to raising your hand. This is a doctrine that is actually much more difficult to, in practice, do anything about, and that's the reason why I end up basically suggesting that we should abandon this. And let me explain why. As Madam Speaker has indicated, R2P was an effort to reinterpret the theory of national sovereignty that has been with us since 1648. And it's been progressively entrenched in the way in which we practice global politics. Westphalian sovereignty, the sovereignty that was embraced and institutionalized at Westphalia in 1648, asserts that each bit of territory on the earth and a chunk of the oceans besides belongs to a particular sovereign. And that each sovereign, each supreme political authority, is supreme over that territory and all the human beings within it. The ideology of national sovereignty claims that no other sovereign has the legitimate right to intrude into that space or demand political obedience from any other human being. Now, Westphalian sovereignty is actually a very simple idea. And the simplicity of it is one of the reasons why, over the last 400 years, it's become so deeply entrenched. so entrenched today that despite your votes, the fact is that the vast majority of human beings, and certainly every single one of the sovereigns out there, remains deeply committed to its tenets. And importantly, the ideology of sovereignty is practiced every day in a million different little ways. And sovereignty as practice is so deeply entrenched that we take it for granted. And that's why it works. People live out its simple message in their day-to-day activities. And that's one of the reasons why I basically say, we say that R2P should be abandoned. Not abolished, just abandoned, forgotten about. For R2P challenges the traditional tenets of sovereignty. It claims not only that sovereigns have rights, the right to be supreme, the right to govern within their territory, the right to be unfettered by other sovereigns, but R2P says that sovereigns have responsibility. The responsibility to protect their people from the scourges of four things that can happen. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Now, one can make the claim that this is what sovereignty entails if one wishes. You can say, yes, states have rights, sovereigns have rights, they also have responsibilities. But unless people live that claim, put it into practice, believe in it, then let me suggest to you that it's simply useless. And I want to suggest that despite all the fine talk at the United Nations over the last decade and a half, for all of the resolutions and the reports of the Secretary General of the UN, the reality is that we actually do not believe this claim. We don't put it into practice. We don't live the claim of responsibility that states have responsibilities as well as rights. And we don't live the claim that the international community has a responsibility and a right to act if sovereigns don't take their responsibility to protect the citizens within their territory. And that's the reason why Madam Speaker, all people in this room who raised their hand in support of a continuation of R2P, to think about what, if you opened your papers this morning, or you saw yesterday's news, either on TV or online, you will have seen a picture that is circulating around the world. It is of two young Syrian boys, probably 7, 8 years old, and they are covered in the dust, and they have the wounds that are created when a barrel bomb, in other words, an oil barrel filled with explosives, are dropped on an apartment building, the way that it was in Syria, by the sovereign of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And we can mourn these little boys killed by their sovereign, and we might even curse the Assad regime. But note that we do nothing. And why? Well, in our view, Madam Speaker, it's because we, in this room, like so many other hundreds of millions of human beings around the world, are simply too attached to sovereignty as it has been practiced for 400 years. And your own lack of willingness to take action, and the lack of willingness of others to take action when faced with the huge crimes against humanity being committed by the sovereign in Syria and in other places, implicitly, in my view, makes our case for it tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor NOSSAL for his remarks, and I welcome Professor Pentland to open the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and like my predecessor. Can you guys hear me at the back? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Like my predecessor at this podium, I would also congratulate the organizers of this session. I hope it proves to be a learning experience for all of us, including the ones up here. Responsibility to protect is one of those big ideas that comes along every once in a while. Now, being a big idea doesn't make it a good idea, but I'm going to argue that in this case it is. And furthermore, that it has, in fact, become more entrenched than its critics would tend to argue. Now, we've already heard that sovereignty emerged basically as a right of sovereigns, but I would certainly add to the point that right at the outset there was implicit in that right also responsibility. And that is articulated in the 2001 report of the International Commission for Intervention in State Sovereignty, which of course brought forth this idea as a reaction to the events of the 1990s. They put it this way, that a state has the responsibility to protect its citizens, its own citizens, from what we call unavoidable catastrophes, specifically genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. When a state is unable or unwilling to do so, responsibility must be borne by the international community. And I guess at that point I would just interject, if not the international community, by whom, in fact? Another state acting singly, some other form of actor? If we take these enormous problems seriously, there ought to be another place than the delinquent state on whom responsibility can then be placed. Now, it's important to note that while a lot of attention in the debate about R2P has been placed on forcible intervention by, in a sense, the armies of the international system, R2P is much broader based than that, and the use of force, in fact, is very much a last resort. So to measure it against whether we have, in fact, used force to overthrow bad guys or not, is only to grasp part of the problem. R2P is, in fact, based on what they call 3 pillars. The primary responsibility for the protection of citizens remains with the state. It is, however, and this is the second pillar, the responsibility of the international community to encourage and assist states who may be falling short of that responsibility. Third, it is the responsibility of the international community to use, in the first place, diplomatic, humanitarian, economic, and other peaceful means to protect the citizens of a delinquent state. If that state continues manifestly to fail because it's unable or unwilling to protect its citizens, then and only then the international community must be prepared to intervene forcefully. What this does really, I would submit, is recognize the need for a normative framework to govern humanitarian intervention, which, as we know, has gone on from time immemorial. And the argument is it's time to have a governing framework, not only to enable it in some cases, but to regulate it in other cases. I don't think we need, I won't repeat the background which Professor NOSSAL has touched upon already, the notion of sovereignty, the notion of non-intervention, and how the emergence of human rights as a preoccupation in the middle of the 20th century began to change some of those things. During the Cold War, there was a tension in the United Nations between, on the one hand, adherence to these sacred Westphalian principles, non-intervention either by another state or by the UN itself into the domestic affairs of any member, hallowed principles, on the one hand, and on the other hand, new concerns arising very much out of World War II for human rights, supplemented by the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a UN resolution, and the 1948 Genocide Convention. Human rights took a back seat, by and large, during the Cold War, for reasons we can go into. In the 1990s, however, the prevalence of intra-state conflicts, and the cases have been mentioned, Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, a couple of others, and the, shall we say, uneven response of the international community to those events, those atrocities, produced a general, I would say generally recognized need for some kind of better framework in which to regulate and enable what was clearly becoming a basic need of the international system. So we have the report. We have then Kofi Annan, the Secretary General at the time, in his document In Larger Freedom, 2005, advocating the implementation of R2P with respect to those 4 types of atrocities that have been mentioned, and the adoption of R2P officially as UN doctrine in 2005 in the World Summit outcome document. Now, a lot of other things happened at the same time. There was a framework for human rights, a change to the Human Rights Council, the emergence of a peace-building council. You have the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002, and a range of other institutions. Now, some may say, well, that's all just empty institution building. I would submit that these are beginning to have a real bite. And my partner in crime tonight, IRFAN, is going to talk a little bit more about those developments later on. And since, so in the 12 years since the ICIS report, we've accumulated a fair framework of institutions and instruments for promoting and enacting R2P. So what's the record been? Yes, it's been uneven. We've had clear and moderately successful applications. Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Darfur to some extent. We've had clear abuses. Iraq, 2003, Georgia, 2008, and certainly the Crimean thing to the extent that Mr. Putin bothers with any plausible scenario. I suppose he would grab that one as well. We've had unfortunate attempts to apply it where it clearly doesn't fit, and we've had a lot of under-the-radar successes as well. I'll stop at that point because I think I've made the
case. I'd like to thank Professor Pentland for his remarks, and I welcome Julia to the floor to continue proposition side of tonight's case. Hear, hear.
I don't know if this works or not, but
Good.
solid, okay. Okay, so this is the part where I tell you that I know more about IR than Professor Pentland. I'm sure you'll all be very convinced. All right, I'm just using my phone as a timer. I'm not texting anything. Okay. Madam Speaker, I have 99 problems and sovereignty is all of them. R2P cannot just be the feeling to do good, right? It's very natural for us to take a vote and say, yes, I believe that we must do something in the face of genocide. We absolutely can't do nothing. The question becomes, can we actually do something? Will we actually do something? And if we do, what is it that we do? I'm going to talk to you about the framework that Professor NOSSAL and I are operating under, and I'm going to talk to you about the effects, what happens even when we do intervene, recognizing the fact that R2P is necessarily inconsistent. We think that's a problem on both sides of the house, but I think when you legitimize inconsistent interventions, you get worse effects when you have R2P as a doctrine. So R2P, to have meaning, must have instruments and mechanisms. When you invoke R2P, something should happen, right? There are no appropriate instruments or mechanisms. I'm going to talk to you about that first. So first of all, the IR framework that we're operating under. So humanitarianism still exists, and we've heard on both sides, and Professor Nelson mentioned this already, right? That there is codified in international law, and there are some precedents for humanitarian interventions. What's different about R2P is that it changes the meaning of sovereignty, as Professor NOSSAL outlined. So that sovereignty is now not only rights, but is duties. Sovereignty is contingent on the fulfillment of those duties, and sovereignty is not guaranteed, right? I'll take you in a second, but not right now. So according to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the Security Council will authorize any intervention and shall determine any threat to peace, right? And according to the Geneva Convention, we already have the outlinings of war, right? We already have the rules of war. I'll take you after this point, IRFAN. You should probably sit down. Okay. The thing is, no international law that does invoke humanitarian aid can violate UN Charter, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this, but international humanitarian law is not the basis for taking action outside the scope of the UN Charter, and it cannot be. So maybe a logical answer to this is we'll change the UN Charter to encompass R2P if everyone's accepted it, right? So the problem with this is that the reason even when we accept R2P, that it isn't actually able to be implemented whenever we think it should be, for example, in Syria, is because Russia and China sit on the Security Council. And when you have these big international interests, even a world where they don't sit on the Security Council, right? You can't just write them out of the Charter and pretend that they are going to do things like condone infringing on the sovereignty of a country with whom they are formally allies. So there actually isn't a way to implement this when sovereignty is entrenched as the international norm and has been since 1648, right? You actually can't recognize that this can be enforced on all countries. This isn't going to be effective. IRFAN disagrees. You can.
Oh, sorry, you said that sovereignty has never been, you talked about Syria and the inconsistencies, and how come the international community said yes to the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2013 after Libya to authorize force?
So the international community says yes sometimes, and I'm going to talk to you about that after, but why it's actually worse that we have inconsistent invocations of R2P, and when those are invoked, they are in the national interest of the countries that have power over the decisions of the international community, which I think is not very well defined, Madam Speaker. I think that that's a problem as well, right? So I'm going to talk to you about sovereignty and what changes under R2P. It is reconceptualizing sovereignty so that when a state fails in its sovereign duties to protect its citizens, it also resigns its sovereign rights to supremacy over its people and area, right? But when sovereignty is not absolute, sovereignty is always threatened. The problem with the international community getting responsibility for these things is the international community is not just a nebulous thing that makes its own decisions. It is made up of individual states, and these individual states always have their national interests at heart and will act according to their national interests. We know this because we've seen the US do this, right? Because we know that more people are now talking about Obamacare and the launch of the website than are talking about the civil war in Syria. We know that even when R2P exists, it is inconsistently invoked. I think that's a problem. So if the international community can make decisions to essentially revoke the sovereignty of a country when it chooses or according to certain criteria, right? Sovereignty itself becomes tenuous and apparently or actually reliant on a state's relations with other states. States like the US, the nature of the UN, NATO, China, and Russia, for example, right? So this has a couple problems, not 99, but okay, the international community becomes a guarantor and an ineffective one for what should have been the responsibility of the state. It cannot guarantee that it always intervened to save people who were suffering under Assad, right? But now they have that hypothetical guarantee, which is a problem because it does reduce the responsibility of that state to its people. We cannot allow people to rely on this kind of intervention when its existence or effectiveness is not guaranteed. Second of all, codified state relations are incredibly important, and that's why sovereignty is entrenched and accepted, excuse me, right? So in their absence, the hegemony of states which already are in power is expanded. If the international community can decide when sovereignty is no longer applicable, this gives the states that make the problems or make the decisions of the international community, states like the US, the states who have the power to make these decisions about legitimate sovereignty, have power magnified, and they add this to the arsenal of hegemony that already exists for states like the US. So lots of sovereign states like Russia and China don't like this. I'm going to talk to you about efficacy, and I'm going to talk to you about outcomes. Actually, I've already talked to you about selective sovereignty and why I think that's a problem. So like best case scenario, these states resign their rights to the UN, right? But the problem is the UN doesn't even have the resources, they don't have the funding or the troops to go in where peacekeeping already exists, right? Where they have already been invited in to keep the peace. They actually cannot fulfill those obligations already. There is absolutely no guarantee that they will be able to fulfill even more obligations when this is invoked, especially according to Chapter 7 of the Charter, right? When they still have to be passed by the UN Security Council. So the UN already has these problems, right? So probably they're going to rely on the resources of other countries like the US or other organizations like NATO, right? They rely on third-party independent actors. And the US gives the UN nearly a quarter of its peacekeeping budget already, right? So the question is then, will these states act according to R2P? No, they will act according to their national interests, and we know this because they already have. So what are the effects of this? I'm going to talk to you about outcomes very quickly. I have a lot of subpoints, but I might skim over some of them, right? So there's absolutely no guarantee that intervention will actually give a better outcome than non-intervention when intervention happens. I have a couple of examples for you. But the problem is this. The problem is state building. It takes a really, really long time. Things that the UN or anyone who intervenes needs to engage in when they decide to invoke this and revoke the sovereignty of a government, right? It's things like establishing a new legitimate government that is accepted by the international community and by the people. In a country that is ravaged by civil war and has a lot of factions that disagree, it is absolutely not clear what a legitimate government means. It requires like mitigating the environmental harms that happen when war happens, right? And that might take a really long time. It requires establishing an economy. This economy, when it is established by actors like the US or actors who control the UN Security Council, is not necessarily going to be the most stable one. When you have, for example, private security companies setting up like their own private interests and buying up war zone real estate, which does happen, Madam Speaker, then you have this restructuring of the economies, restructured around private interests that come from places like the US. That's a problem. Intervention does not necessarily lead to better outcomes. I point you towards Somalia, which has had 3 UN interventions, a US-backed Ethiopian intervention in 2006, an African Union intervention in 2009, and 3 different failed transitional governments, and is still not a state. Intervention is absolutely not necessarily guaranteed. We legitimize inconsistent interventions, and the US acting in its own national interest when we pretend to invoke R2P inconsistently, and even when we do, it does not necessarily lead to good outcomes. We beg to propose.
Julia for her remarks, and I welcome IRFAN to continue the side for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, we've heard today a whole bunch of things, legitimizing inconsistency, and it seems like it's the logical fallacies proposed by the proposition that makes R2P really, really bad, which I just don't get. So I'm going to get right into it. If it is in the U.S.'s interest, for example, to get rid of Gaddafi and R2P is invoked and civilians aren't safe, it is not a logical counter to say, well, the U.S. had ulterior motives, all states have multiple motives, and the possibility that saving civilians is not the primary goal when R2P is invoked is irrelevant to the question. The question is, does R2P, which is the legal mechanism that all states have agreed to, is that going to save lives? Which brings me to the next thing. We talk, side proposition brought about this whole idea of sovereignty, and I mean, if I were in the audience listening to sovereignty, I think that it's this static notion from 1648 today that hasn't been changed, but what we've seen is that this is a concept that's not static, it moves all the time, it changes all the time, and so what we see here is that it is evolutionary. That's what Dr. Pentland talked about. It is not revolutionary, it's not that ridiculous. What it does is, like, we do not ignore the reality presented by contemporary international relations, but we understand that widely recognized conventions begin as an idea which can grow, find supporters, and through a complex dialectical process can act as a check to some of the to some of the violence that our world can produce. And we recognize the taboo of overzealous truth claims, which is why we understand that R2P will experience turbulent times at its initial stage, and which is why R2P never claimed to eliminate all human suffering, but R2P will close the gap between rhetorical support and tangible commitment, as it will force international actors to make a decision of inaction on inhumane crimes against civilians. That's what happened in Libya. 5 members abstained. That's a lot of people who say they don't know what they want to do, but what R2P does is it forces you to make that decision of inaction in front of crimes against humanity. But Dr. Nelson disagrees. Yes, sir.
R2P was not invoked in the case of Libya, surely.
Yes, sir.
R2P was invoked in the case of Libya. R2P, all members of the international community in 2001 and 2005 signed on to R2P, which says that under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, you are able to use force when necessary. And in the case of Libya, that did happen. People always say, well, Libya happened, and so now Russia and China are pissed, so they're just going to veto everything. That's just what's going to happen. Well, is that really the case? Let's look at Mali in 2012, Resolution 2085. They authorized military intervention, and that worked. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Resolution 2098 in 2013, saw the creation of a brigade called the Intervention Brigade, which is authorized to use force, but you disagree because you don't have people.
Humanitarian interventions have happened both before R2P was established and afterwards, but we still ignore places like Syria under R2P because it is structurally...
So thank you so much. So the case in Syria was actually not that R2P was wrong, it's whether R2P actually applied. Nobody questioned, nobody questioned whether R2P was a good thing in and of itself. It had to do with whether those specific criteria applied to the case, and I would remind side of proposition that the reason why we have R2P is because the world did nothing in the face of Rwanda and in the face of Bosnia, which is why you have this new concept come about called R2P, because it's a recognition from the international world that we need to do something more. So, are the necessary conditions in place for it to succeed? And I think there is. Why? Because number one, there is universal consensus on its basic principles. If you look at the meetings from the United Nations General Assembly since 2009, you will see that states have expressed concern over the notion of timely, decisive action, but no one challenges that concept. Further, no states disagree about the responsibility of the state as outlined by R2P, as well as the responsibility of other states to help fellow states meet that commitment. Problems of mistrust, which I've already talked about in the Libya case. But what's interesting in the problem of mistrust is that in 2011, Brazil came up with this new thing and said it's called responsibility while protecting. And what they said was, what was the problem in Libya? It was never in the beginning. When Resolution 1973 was passed, everybody said that all necessary force was needed. And China liked it because the African Union supported it. That's going to be my next point about regional organizations and why they're instrumental. But if you look at the mistrust, it was Brazil in 2011, and they addressed this issue and they said, you know what, in Libya, the big problem was the after effect. It came with regime change. Now, I agree with NATO, which is that if you want peace in Libya, if you want a responsibility to protect, you need regime change in that case, because even though Gaddafi and his son said, we'll have elections, we find out the next day that they're air raiding civilians. So that's not okay. And I don't think our generation's okay with that. We're starting to say that that's not enough, and you can do stuff. And that's what we're saying. It's just that military intervention is the last thing. There's a spectrum of options available for people to use. And then we're always focusing on Syria. We're always focusing on these cases. But we never focus about Cote d'Ivoire, about Kenya in 2008, and what about all the other additional cases with R2Ps being invoked in Zimbabwe, in Kyrgyzstan, and Burma. So, I mean, okay, yeah, moving on. The next one is the role of regional organizations. The main reason why China supported intervention in Libya was because they saw the overwhelming support, the African Union, and the organization of the Islamic Conference, and the Arab League. The Arab League does nothing. They woke up from their slumber finally, and they said, yes, get rid of this guy. Now, have we seen that growing interest from regional organizations? Well, we have. I mean, we have the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. You have all these other regional organizations who are helping and playing a very active role in ensuring that this responsibility to protect mandate is upheld. And so, have the principles shown their real worth through the real world cases? I think they have. I think it's going. I mean, considering that R2P was only entrenched, was only signed on and made official and all that stuff in 2005, and it's 2014, it's been a decade. We have all these cases that show that there is something happening where people are being saved. And on top of it, we are looking at the concept of sovereignty. I don't understand the double standard that side proposition is putting on us. Sorry, I don't understand the DJ song, just slow down. Side proposition is making it, the double standard that they have for sovereignty, and they're holding it to responsibility to protect, which is saying, like, no, responsibility to protect, it's got to be perfect, it's got to be absolutely perfect, but it doesn't work in this case, it's inconsistent here, it's inconsistent there. Well, what about sovereignty? Sovereignty is not consistent, people do it all the time. The only reason why the UK recognized Brazil is because Brazil passed a law that said slavery was bad, which is good in our case, but I'm just saying, like, sovereignty is a human-made phenomenon just like everything else. It can't be moved, it's evolutionary, it's not revolutionary. And finally, we now have a legal vocabulary. Are we saying that if R2P was there before Rwanda happened, that Rwanda would not have happened? No, that's not what we're saying. But if there was, and this whole process that we went up to where people discussed and talked, and all the states, might I remind everybody, all the states, this whole notion that this is this Western liberal, colonial thing, that's not there. I know Side Prop didn't bring it up, but some of you might be thinking of it, that's not it. And so, for those reasons, side opposition would like to think that this responsibility to protect, it is a good doctrine. It's not inconsistent with what we currently have. Yes, it's going to be a bit tough in the beginning, but I think we can figure it out. Thank you.
IRFAN for his remarks, and because we've heard so much content throughout this round, I'd like to welcome Professor Pentland back to the floor to crystallize this round for side opposition in his 3-minute speech, all of which will be protected time. Here.
This is going to sound like you've entered a time warp now, because I'm going to actually speak much more slowly than I can't move my mouth that fast. Okay. Wow. The world of R2P is a messy place. The notion of sovereignty in the 21st century is messy. There's this inconsistency all over the place. But as has been said, think about other big normative ideas like sovereignty, You know, in the 17th century, when sovereignty came to the fore through Westphalia, there were lots of folks around who said, this is a terrible idea, breaking up Europe into all of these little principalities with big ideas about themselves. What we really need is to go back to the empire or back to the universal church. We don't want to go in this direction of fragmentation. Sovereignty's dreadful. It'll lead to awful, well, it did actually lead to awful things. So, you know, inconsistency in the application of that big idea, it's taken 300 or 400 years to get to a state of elegant simplicity, as somebody once earlier described it. There's a lot of perceptions out there, mistaken perceptions about R2P, and I think we've just heard a few of them re-articulated. It's the end of Westphalian sovereignty. Well, no, it isn't. Westphalian sovereignty has been compromised all along. It's always allowed for intervention. It's always been a little bit inconsistent, and its purity is a myth. Oh, it's a license to invade for great powers with neo-colonial or other motivations. You most often hear this from people who have some justified fear of being invaded. I'm sure that Bashar al-Assad was one of those who said, this is a dreadful idea. Imagine I can't do exactly what I want to do because maybe somebody's going to attack me for it. So the license to invade thing has really been exaggerated, and as we've heard, in 2005 and subsequently, a lot of changes have been made to the doctrine, some rethinking, the Brazilians and others, South Africa, bringing the doctrine to a position where it is less frightening to people who shouldn't be frightened about it. It should be frightening to the bad guys out there. Too difficult to use. I think a lot of the, how much time have I got?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. You know, a lot of the argument we've heard is that it's too difficult to use, you can never get things through the Security Council, and so on. What would you rather have? Would you rather have a system which simply allowed intervention rule-free by any power that wanted to do it at any time? We have the Council. It's supposed to make that decision difficult. So there's a need to defend R2P against the zealots who want to use it everywhere, and more importantly, against the principled or cynical realists and the tyrants who want to be afraid of it. I think I'm done. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Pentland for closing off the side for opposition, and I welcome Professor Nossal back to the floor to close off the side for side proposition.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's clear that my honourable member opposite really needed some of what was in his colleague's glass to speed himself along. And indeed, it seems to me that both the speed of the presentations and the fact that my honourable member opposite was unable to get through his argument is indicative of the problem with R2P. What I want to do is to bring this home in a very direct way. We've talked tonight about R2P in very, very abstract terms, and indeed, you all started off by expressing your conviction that R2P was something that not only needed to be retained, but continued. And the difficulty I want to suggest to you is that you actually don't believe it in the sense of being able and willing to put it into practice. Our opposition have talked about the difficulties of practice. My colleague has talked about the inconsistency. It seems to me that it's this, more than anything else, that should lead us to be skeptical of something that we don't ourselves want to participate in. When was the last time you heard anyone in this country urge the government of Canada to commit blood and treasure to the protection of civilians in other places. And it should be noted that in the case of Libya, Resolution 1973 was indeed about the protection of civilians, but it was not an invocation of the responsibility to protect in terms of what kind of operation it was. It was a Chapter 7 operation. It was not an R2P operation. It was about the protection of civilians in Libya. But the reality is we don't want to do that as Canadians. And if we don't want to do that as Canadians, then it seems to me we need to ask ourselves, what exactly are we in support of? In fact, what it seems to me is that our failure to act suggests what we're really in support of. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
So, I would like to thank all members for a wonderful and entertaining debate. And at this point in time, I'd like to open the floor to a question period that can be addressed to any of the members that have spoken. So I'll just stand at the front, and I'll take any questions. Question period lasting for 15 minutes starts now. So we just have a question right at the back.
Hi, should I introduce myself?
If you could just speak a little louder and also introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name's Michael. So I have a question towards the opponents of R2P. What will you do about the Security Council problem? If anything is against the interest of one of the 5 members of the permanent Security Council, you know that they will definitely support it. So how will you get past that and make sure every single possible thing is always with the interest of all 5 permanent members who have ultimate control over the Security Council? Thank you.
Well, it's already actually in the doctrine of R2P, it already states that if a resolution were to come up and one of the 5 Security Council members are to be affected, then they could just veto it. So R2P recognizes the reality that you cannot, for example, if you were ever to use R2P for the Xinjiang in China, you would not be able to because they veto it. So in that case, that's what we mean by it does not, it realizes those realist perspectives. And so it does put in a provision that says that if one of the UN Security Council members don't have an interest at the stake at hand, then they should be encouraged to vote against, they should be encouraged to not vote against the motion. Abstaining and supporting is okay, but with regards to the UN Security Council, yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Yep, we have.
My name is Spencer. I'm a 4th-year politics student here, and my question is actually directed at Professor Nossal about something that you said in your closing remarks regarding the intervention that occurred in Libya, claiming that it wasn't an operation under R2P, it was an operation under Chapter 7. So my question for you is, what do you see as the fundamental difference between a humanitarian intervention operating under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and a humanitarian intervention operating under R2P? Is it simply the legal invocation of R2P in the specific resolution, or is it something else? And would an R2P operation not fall under the purview of a Chapter 7 action?
Your last question is a very technical one that I'm going to defer to my honorable colleague over here. In the sense of whether or not an R2P, the invocation of R2P by the Security Council, whether or not it would be a Chapter 7, I honestly don't believe so, because you would have to invoke Chapter 7 in the resolution. And so that I think that the moment you invoke Chapter 7, I think that R2P is not on the table. Chapter 7 is about threats to international peace and security. And it seems to me that when in the case of Libya, what the Gaddafi regime was doing to citizens in Libya was indeed a threat to international peace and security, and it was recognized as such by both the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. they were sufficiently willing to bend to the involvement of the African Union that they chose to abstain, along with a number of other rather important countries. Their abstention, though, it seems to me, was a signal of their profound concern about how this would go. And as you all know, Libya started off as a Chapter 7 mission to protect Libyan civilians. It very, very quickly turned into regime change, protected by, and this is what really annoyed both the Russian Federation and the PRC, protected by Resolution 1973. The fact is that the Russians and Chinese found themselves snookered by the fact that they had agreed to a resolution through their abstentions that was now providing cover for NATO and the Western Alliance to go after regime change. And I would basically suggest that it was the Libyan adventure that now ensures that both the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation will always, always, always vote against, rather than allow the West to have its way the way it did in March of 2011, February, March of 2011.
So I suppose after that answer, I'm going to give open up the floor to any questions or give the opposition a chance to respond.
Could I just add that actually there is no incompatibility between R2P and the use of Chapter 7. In fact, how else can you engage in a forceful intervention into an unwilling country unless you invoke Chapter 7? That is the vehicle by which the UN operates. But certainly I don't disagree with the interpretation of Libya and where that's led us. I think it was unfortunate about a regime, well, unfortunate in that sense anyway, about regime change. But and I would argue that Resolution 1973 is a very timid invocation of R2P. You do find the responsibility ... to protect the lives of civilians in the text. Now, there wasn't a ringing endorsement, no, and that's the reason is that you wanted to make sure that some people who would have bristled at the explicit invocation of the resolution could live with that language. That's politics. Get used to it.
So we have a question here from you too.
Yeah, so I think one of the more interesting things brought up during the debate, and I'd love to hear Professor Pentland's response and a response from you guys just really quickly, is that, as we all know, I mean, the Syrian example is a good example of where R2P has been invoked as an argument and then firmly rejected in the form of the Security Council. Does something being a doctrine and being sort of a mantra that can be used for arguments, but then not actually being supported at the Security Council, does that fundamentally does that critically undermine the doctrine as something that should exist? Because I think that was central to Julia's argument, is that because it's applied inconsistently, therefore it shouldn't exist. What do you think about that? And is that a killer argument, or is that something that we should just simply live with?
Well, I would only say that if inconsistency were an argument for something not to exist, we wouldn't have much. It's part of politics, and this is an imperfect. It's an idea that's imperfect in its realization. Yes, of course, but I would argue that it's come a long way since this report in 2001. There have been quite a few substantive and procedural changes which I think arguably promise to make R2P work better in the end. So I don't think you throw it out because it hasn't worked very well so far and there are all sorts of critics around. You make it work better because what is there really a civilized alternative to having a framework, a normative framework, broadly agreed, by the way, look at the 2005 UN session, broadly agreed, that would regulate the use of humanitarian intervention, which we know is going to happen, whether real or bogus. We know it's going to be used. So what is it? Isn't it better to have some kind of framework in which to attempt to shape this and use it in the way that makes sense.
Can I just intervene here and say that it's not so much the inconsistency that should banish this, as much as what the inconsistency does to the prediction about what the results are going to be. One of the concerns, I think, with R2P is that because there is such generalized support for it from people who basically have no willingness to back it up in any serious way, what it does is to provide this belief on the part of some folks who are indeed the target of their own government's slaughter, that somehow the international community, this thing called the international community, is going to respond. And I must admit, I just think that what we need to do is to reflect the reality that indeed Professor Pentland pointed out, and that is there is going to be this kind of intervention. But what will drive that intervention? What will drive it are national interests, the selfish interests of political communities who will, when it comes down to it, intervene with the use of force. The way, for example, Vietnam intervened in Cambodia in 1978, early 79, when what the Cambodian regime was doing to its people, mass slaughter, was producing what economists would call negative externalities. Folks running across the border into Vietnam. Vietnam no longer could stand it, and so they simply invaded and overthrew the Cambodian government. A couple of months later, Tanzania invaded Uganda, overthrew the government there for its slaughter of its people. In other words, when we look carefully at those folks who will in fact intervene and relieve the slaughter of people by their government, that's the predictable, and that's the thing that it seems to me we want to entrench in practice, because that's predictable. To have this notion that people will in the abstract agree to, but when it comes down to it, when it actually comes down to the kind of slaughter that we're seeing in Syria and no one is doing anything about it, or as in the case of Darfur 11 years ago, when we all knew what the Janjaweed were doing to the Fur, and yet we sat on our hands and did nothing about it, for all of the fine words of R2P, it seems to me that tells us more about this particular doctrine than anything else.
So we have time for one more question. There is only 3 minutes left, so we'll take the question next day.
So I just wanted to touch on IRFAN's point with regional organizations. So it seems to me that regional organizations either on one hand be the kind of linchpin that suggests that R2P in fact doesn't operate effectively and is completely dependent on regional organizations, or alternatively that regional organizations are the kind of reasonable vehicle through which we can exercise R2P, given that the UN kind of lacks a kind of unified international force to do so effectively. So what's the role of regional organizations in either legitimizing or alternatively, some might suggest, in being evidence of the illegitimacy or the inefficacy of R2P?
So from what I understand and from what I've read, so first of all, there's nothing in R2P that says you need to have regional organizations. That kind of came about organically whenever they started going into places like Libya and whatnot. And when you realize, for example, if you look at the reason why China did not vote no, the biggest one, and the reason why the United States also went in was because the Arab League said yes. There was also the Organization of Islamic Conference, and I already mentioned African Union, although they were less so because they're getting money from Gaddafi. But overall, the legitimacy, that's the correct word, the legitimacy behind a lot of the campaigns and missions are asserted when these regional organizations also come on. And what you notice, what I notice when I see the trends, and especially the examples I brought up with Africa in the latter half of my talk, is that there's more and more willingness for these regional organizations to participate. They're also like, they take their own action, they go out of their way and they say, I can't remember what case it is, I'll see if I can find it, but basically there is currently an Democratic Republic of Congo, my apologies. So Resolution 2098 in 2013 authorized the use of military intervention under an intervention brigade, and then the African Union said, listen, this is not going to work. You need a peacekeeping operation that's more intense. So the African Union basically, they worked with they're in conjunction with another group, and they said, we'll do this kind of as a temporary thing for now, moving forward, and then we'll try and find a next step for it. So for me, that says that, for example, if regional organizations out there bolsters the legitimacy, but to be fair to side proposition, ulterior motives do matter, and nobody here is disregarding that. But just to sort of touch on that very sort of realist perspective on how a state operates, in my opinion, it's ever more necessary and important that we have something like this, because we know states are only going to think about their interests and order and all that stuff. So R2P is that thing that drags them and kind of coordinates all what I see in a way that can align their interests that so happen to be also a good in the world.
And we'll just have a very quick response from Juliet, after which point, hopefully won't last more than a minute. We will take another vote.
Okay, I'd be really fast, but I don't think regional organizations actually change the framework under which R2P operates, because it necessarily invokes the international community. Whether or not they work with regional organizations is actually like less important than whether or not they're intervening in the first place, right? So the states that make up the international community are still dictated by their own national interests, like we talked about in our speeches. And if those interests are tied to regional organizations, then perhaps that can exercise influence in dictating whether or not a state will intervene. But I don't think when it comes to countries like China that are really like hardline on not intervening in Syria, right? I don't think that ends up making as much of a difference. So if they're tied to the interests of the organizations, then I think it's still a realization of the national interests that dictate whether or not R2P is implemented, and I think that's the actual problem.
Okay, so at the end of this question period, I'd like to thank the debaters once again for a wonderful debate. So if we can just give them a round of applause. And before we take a vote, I'd just like to have everybody recall what happened at the beginning of this round, where everybody voted very little in favor of proposition and very much in favor of opposition. So the way that this round and the win will be adjudicated is whichever side has the biggest swing in votes. So whichever side was able to convince the most people that they are now correct wins. So I suppose I will now bring this this round to a vote. So all those in favor of abolishing the doctrine of R2P from the realm of international politics, please raise your hands. All right. And now I would like to ask, so all those against abolishing the doctrine of R2P from the realm of international politics, please raise your hands. So, at the conclusion of this debate, I'd like to announce the winner as side proposition, who is able to convince the most amount of people to swing in favor of their this side of the motion. So, I guess a round of applause to side proposition for winning this debate. Up from 4 to 17. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Renata, for moderating tonight's debate. Let's give her a round of applause. I'd like to thank everybody who came in tonight. I'd also like to thank our 4 debaters this evening, as well as the Politicus team who made this possible, including the hard work of the Queen's International Affairs Association and the Queen's Debating Union. Just a couple of announcements. Politicus is currently in the middle of hiring. If you're interested in applying for the editor-in-chief position, applications are due on Friday, along with any of the other management board and editorial board positions. You can find them all online at queensassist.com. As well, we'll also be having our launch party for the journal on Tuesday, March 25th in the Assis Red Room. We encourage you all to come out and see which articles we have commissioned for publication this year out of the ones who have submitted for the undergraduate publication. Maybe Professor Pentland will be there, maybe Professor NOSSAL, we'll see. But no reaction. But it should be a lot of fun. It's at 7 p.m. March 25th in the Assis Red Room. We encourage you all to come out and support our young, budding students who are going to be published next week. So if you have any questions, please come and ask myself or Woody, who's our workshops and lectures coordinator. Thank you so much for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you next year for our public lecture series. Thank you so much.